All right. So thank you guys for coming in here. So I guess my talk's about development and compliance. My colleague here couldn't make it because of some logistical issues. Before I get started, just a show of hands, how many of you, as part of your development, had a run-in with compliance? Okay. All right, and then I guess not a whole bunch here, but how many of you, I guess, of those who had a run-in, absolutely love or hate compliance, or I guess implementing it? All right, so let's get started. So in terms of my background's development background. So I've been working for a few years now, like 6 years for Foundstone, doing AppSec work. White box, black box. I'm also a PCI-DSS qualified security assessors, so doing compliance from that standpoint. But like I said, before I switched sides, I was a developer, and my first run-in with compliance was as a developer, right? So now I'm on the other side of things. The goal here is, every time, I guess most times we are doing compliance audits. There's a big gap between what the compliance says and what gets interpreted, right? The compliance regulations aren't the most clear. They have quite a few ambiguities, multiple ways to interpret them, and you end up with a situation where the product is still not compliant, right? So the goal is to kind of go over like the top 20 things or 25 things, right, as a developer that you want to kind of be doing so that you're on the right side of compliance, right? A lot of compliance, or I guess before I go ahead, this is not a comprehensive compliance class, right? A lot of compliance also have a concept of compensating control, right? And what that means is, I'm not doing X, Y, and Z that the compliance asks me to, but I'm doing A, B, C, D, E, and F, based on which you could go to the compliance committee or the standards body and say, hey, because I'm doing A through F, give me an exception, right? So compensating controls are exceptions, not the norm. So the idea is, even if you are not doing certain things, you might still be able to be compliant. And the other thing is, becoming compliant is just not about the things that I talk about here, right? There's more things to compliant. What I'm trying to put forth in the bunch of next slides is the top, X things that when an auditor is assessing your product or your application, it's going to be like a flag, right? So the top X things, but not all of the things, right? So I guess. So here's kind of the agenda, so to speak. A little bit of background, and then in terms of the best practices or the top X things, what I've done is I've kind of broken it down into technology, people, and process. So we'll look at each of them one after the other. So to start with, right, the need for regulatory compliance, right? If you've been following news in the past few years, there have definitely been a few, headline grabbers, right? Like few infamous cases. In the Heartland payment systems, the TJX case, where millions of cardholders were impacted because of their credit card numbers being disclosed. Telstra, this is back down in Australia, where thousands of users had their personal information leaked through the application. From the healthcare standpoint, a few Massachusetts area hospitals who had a common service provider lost data on, again, quite a few patients having diagnostic details. And then another, like Veteran Affairs organization lost details on millions of veterans, I guess. So the whole goal of these compliances is to stop this from happening, right? It's to protect the end users and their data that these third party or the applications collect from it, right? That's the whole goal. I guess from an intent standpoint, like I said, safeguarding this sensitive data. And by safeguarding, what we mean is ensuring that it's confidential, it's only accessible to the right people, and so forth. Now, the common reason, right, why there's this disconnect between the development community and the compliance regulations. One is, if you have happened to read these compliance regulations, right, the wording tends to be legal, right? Like it tends to be written by lawyers more than a developer or an architect or somebody on the technical side, right? There are different ways to interpret it, and the other kind of thing that it causes the disconnect or the misinterpretation is that most commonly the regulation will say, this is what you got to do, right? This is the end result. But there's nothing said about, what I need to do in order to achieve it, right? So different people potentially interpret it in different ways, some acceptable, some non-acceptable. And hence you kind of end up in the situation, which is kind of really bad, that, you spent X hours studying this compliance and making sure your app is compliant, only to find out that when an external auditor came into the scene, he said it's non-compliant because your protections are not enough, right? So now not only have you spent this X hours already, but you're going to have to spend another Y hours fixing it. So it's kind of a pretty bad situation to get into. And, on the contrary, if you've seen these regulations, right, while it may be very ambiguous on how you achieve it, it's pretty well defined, distinct on the way, or I guess on the impact of non-compliance, right? There are very clear-cut fines written up as an impact of non-compliance, or for that matter, even potential prison time. Leave alone the fact that maybe because of non-compliance, because of the press, you're going to have potentially a PR issue, potentially an issue where your customers don't really have the same amount of confidence in you, don't really trust you with your data, which eventually leads into a lack of business revenue. So the impact is pretty clear cut. However, the means to achieve compliance is pretty ambiguous. The other thing is most compliance regulations have a pretty wholesome approach to achieving compliance, right? So they will touch upon operational security, they will touch upon network security, they'll touch upon physical security, and then they'll touch upon application development security, right? So for today's discussion, all we are focusing is on, from an application developer standpoint, what are the things to be doing, things to not be doing. So some sample compliance regulations that you've probably heard or run into. The payment card industry probably is one of the most famous. Applies to systems that deal with payment card data, maybe credit card, maybe debit card, whatnot. European Union has its data protection directive to make sure that the information that the application or the system collects is protected and the user knows who has access to it. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, in the US, safeguarding healthcare data. Sarbanes-Oxley, Basel, again more of a European standard. So some compliance regulations out there that you potentially run into. All right, so what have I done here? Essentially what I've done is, mapped these compliance regulations into categories that you can relate to as a developer, right? So essentially what I've done is come up with these categories here, like data protection and storage and transit. Most of them like self-explanatory, what falls in them. But the idea is going forward in the next slides, we'll look at each category and the do's and don'ts in those categories from a compliance standpoint. And the only reason for this categorization and this mapping is so that you can relate to it, right? You don't have to look through the legal wordings to actually understand what it's trying to imply. So here's like some of the top X things in data protection and storage and transit. The first one here, kind of actually sounds like a no-brainer, right? Only store, transmit sensitive data if you cannot do without it. But give it a thought, right? Anytime you're processing this data that the compliance regulation wants to safeguard, give it a thought whether my app can function, whether my business can function without this data, right? So one of the common examples that we have run into is credit card refund systems, right? Now some systems, credit card refund systems, the way they are designed and the environment in which they function, they can work without storing the whole credit card number. They can store the last 4 digits and verify that, and based on that process the refund, right? So the idea is if you're not storing it, if you're not processing it, you don't have this overhead of complying with it, right? So give it a thought. It's, depending on your situation, may not be possible, but at least give it a thought, because if you're not storing it or truncating it, not storing it completely, you don't have to live with this overhead of compliance. From a cryptographic standpoint, as appealing as it sounds, cryptography is pretty hard to implement securely, right? It's one of those things that's easy to do wrong. So, you might write a homegrown, algorithm which can run on multiple processors, give you the most awesome performance, but stay away from homegrown crypto algorithms, right? There are plenty of libraries out there that have implementation of well-known, well-researched cryptographic algorithms that you can simply use rather than writing it something from the ground up. OpenSSL, if you're doing programming or your development in C, C++, Windows or Unix, you could use OpenSSL, right? If you're a .NET has a pretty rich library of crypto implementation. Java, same thing. So you really shouldn't run into a situation where you have to write up something on your own for your crypto needs. So this next one, which says use strong one-way hashes to ensure integrity. So I guess the idea there, I'm going to kind of jump ahead next to the next one, which is whenever possible, use strong one-way hashes rather than reversible encryption algorithm. So the idea is, a very quick primer on one-way hash. A one-way hash is something that takes your input like a string and gives you a hash as the output, right? There's no way to go back from a hash to the clear text string, right? There's just no way, given that the algorithm is secure enough. So the idea there is, one very common example is your password, right? Nobody needs to know your clear text password, right? If you store it in a one-way hash format, given that you're using the right amount of salt and the right algorithm, even if my database is compromised, I don't have to worry that somebody will be able to recover the clear text password, right? So whenever possible, right, when you don't need the clear text data back, hash it, so that essentially your liability is decreased because there's no way to go back to the clear text data. Right? With reversible encryption, given that, or I guess in this scenario, the key was compromised, you could always extract the clear text back. With one-way hash, there's no possibility, unless you run a brute force attack, and then given that you are using the right salt and the right algorithm, you can make a brute force attack potentially computationally infeasible. Mask sensitive data within the application user interface. So again, within the application screens, you don't want to show up your social security number, your credit card number, your national ID numbers completely in clear. And what is the idea? The idea there is, you want to minimize information disclosure, right? So here the attack would be shoulder surfing, right? The users browsing through the application. A malicious attacker walks behind the user's desk, observes the screen, and gets hold of this potentially sensitive privacy data. So from that standpoint, you want to mask it in your user interface, so you don't have that kind of a scenario. All right, so I kind of jumped a little bit to a side track there, but continuing with crypto, right? The kind of problem is, I'm encrypting data with the right algorithm, with the right key length. Now the problem kind of shifts to, how do I make sure that my keys are secure, right? So a couple of points there. One, most OSS frameworks provide key stores. So like on Windows, there's a key store that you can use, which, the Windows takes care of encrypting it on disk. So, use it to store the key, right? Because, you don't want to end up in a situation where my data is encrypted at rest. However, my key is just world readable, right? Because then you've lost the benefit. If the OS framework is not an option, the key store is not an option, consider using a two-key approach where you have a data encryption key and a key encryption key. So the data encryption key is encrypted with a key encryption key, and both are stored securely and separate. So the idea is, for an attacker to compromise the end data, they would have to compromise two keys: your data encryption key and then also the key encryption keys. Generating the key itself, again, if the key is hard-coded in code, if the key is predictable, all the effort is lost, right? So you want to make sure it's generated randomly, as is. If you're using any salts with your one-way hash function, you want to make sure those are also generated randomly using a secure random number generator or random data generator. And again, most programming platforms, there are APIs available to use it, right? .NET has a RNG crypto service provider, right? OpenSSL has APIs to generate random data. On Unix, there's a couple of files, /dev random, /dev urandom, from which you can read to get random data. And finally, key revocation and rotation, right? So what's the idea here, right? Why do I need key rotation? So the idea is, let's say if my key was compromised, right? If I never change my key, that abuse is going to happen forever, right? There's no way of me to know that, assuming the key is compromised, but I don't know it happened. There's no kind of, there's no way to limit the damage unless I change the key. So that's the idea behind key rotation, right? So you limit this window when the key could be abused and the data could be extracted. And then similarly, key revocation is when the key is compromised and hence I'm going to have to change it. So within the application, within the product, support these primitives. Support the primitive that you can go in and change the key, or for that matter, every 3 months there will be a new random key generated. Now there are a couple of side effects of this. One, a lot of times you do have to store or you do have to keep data that has been encrypted with the old key, right? So what do you do with it? With key rotation, you kind of have two options. I'm going to keep the old data as is and store my old key securely. Or I'm going to decrypt all of that old data, re-encrypt with the new key, and then just throw away the old key, right? So there are a couple of approaches there. With key revocation, the only option you have is to decrypt it and re-encrypt it with the new key. But a couple of side effects there. All right, so that's that's mostly data protection in storage, right? So what we talked about. Now there's this whole other thing of data protection in transit, right? Commonly, you'll have SSL being used to provide this data protection in transit, right? Maybe confidentiality and integrity. Now, with SSL configuration, there are a few things to, I guess, keep a note of. One, make sure you only support SSL v3 or TLS v1, and the idea being SSL v2 has had a few issues like downgrade attack, truncation attack, and you don't want your SSL configuration to be susceptible to the same, right? So have only the right version supported. And similar to the ciphers, right? At the end of the day, SSL supports a bunch of ciphers based on which it provides you confidentiality, integrity, right? So there are weak ciphers, there are strong ciphers. You don't want the weak ciphers because then potentially somebody could launch a brute force attack on the data stream and get the clear text data back. So make sure you've updated the configuration that it will only allow 128-bit ciphers. The next point, self-signed certificates are, you might think it's not, I guess, it shouldn't be common, but they are fairly common, right? The problem is, unless and until you can validate the certificate of the server, there's no way to say necessarily that there isn't a man-in-the-middle attack being done at that moment, right? So you want your server certificate to be issued by a well-known, trusted certificate authority. And with that said, you want your client to validate the server certificate before it actually communicates with the server. Now that last piece there, if it's a web application, your browser is going to do that for you. If it cannot validate it, it gives you that warning message. But particularly in thick client applications, from what we have seen, the name check, right? When you validate the server certificate, you're validating it for a number of things. One is whether it's issued by a trusted root certificate. Another is whether it's expired. Another is whether it is revoked. And finally, you do want to check if it's issued to the same server that you're trying to connect, right? There could be a legitimate malicious server who has a legitimate certificate, but it's not whom you're trying to talk to. So you want to kind of do those validations before you actually go ahead and communicate with the server. All right, so those are like the data protection in storage and transit. Going to the next category, which is authentication, right? So, so one of the things that you want to think about is whether, you probably have an Active Directory as your internal authentication provider. You might have a third-party single sign-on solution that you are using within the organization. Give it a thought whether you can leverage the same for your application, right? If your application is public-facing internet application, maybe you cannot use it, right? You probably don't want to create every internet user a user account in your AD, right? But give it a thought. And the reason I say that is from an application standpoint, you want your developers to concentrate on the application business functionality, right? Authentication is kind of a common, problem for all applications, right? So if you have an existing AD store that you can leverage, leverage it. Don't spend time reinventing this whole authentication mechanism for the same thing. So that saves time. The other benefit it gives you is, most compliance regulations will kind of tell you about, hey, do you have strong authentication controls, strong password controls, right? And then having it on your AD, one, probably it's already there. Your ADs may be already secured and has the right password controls. And two, if not, if you have to do it on an AD, and as an application developer, you don't have to worry about it, right? So all of the change password, account lockout, create user, whatnot, everything will be dealt at an AD level, and you won't have to worry about it. So it kind of simplifies the app from an app developer standpoint, less ways to get authentication wrong. So it's one less variable in the picture. So if it's possible, think about it. The next one, do not use sensitive data as a user identifier. So I guess the scenario we run into is, let's say you are using your national ID as the login identifier, user ID, or your credit card number as a user ID, right? Now, user IDs are not typically protected the same way as passwords are, right? Passwords are potentially hashed and stored in the database. User IDs, they are pretty much clear text in the database. So they don't get the same level of protection, typically, right? And that's kind of the idea, right? Don't use sensitive data in there, because if you are, there's chances that it's stored clear text, right? Another side effect of it, and may not be so much compliant, maybe not so much compliance, is if you use like an ID, like a national ID, social security number, credit card number as a user ID. As a user, I have no way to change it, right? Let's say if I want to change my user ID, unless I go and apply for a new credit card and get it, there's no way I can change my user ID. So in a way, it's, functionally or from a user standpoint also, it's not the best functionality. So, as far as possible, do not use sensitive data as your user ID. And then finally, strong password controls, these talk about your password length, your password history, your password expiry, your password complexity. So I think I have a slide a few slides later, which has a kind of a recommended password controls. And I guess following into authorization, right? You want to make sure there's authorization for every request, which means not only from a display standpoint, right? When I'm displaying the menu options, not only then, but also at a data manipulation standpoint. And the things that you want to check for is essentially if the subject has the privilege to perform the action, which typically is create, read, update, delete on the resource, which could be a file, which could be your data like an account, history, so on and so forth. In the web application world, hidden fields, do not use hidden fields for user or role identifiers. That's a client-side field. It's possible to manipulate it. Similarly, for cookies, don't use cookies for role identifier. Data, again, client-side control can be manipulated. Now, user and session management. So, essentially what we are talking about here are user management principles or operations and session management operations, right? So, password recovery scheme, it's similar to cryptography in the sense that it's easier to get it wrong than right? And, if again, following the news, not too long ago, there was a pretty high-profile incident. Sarah Palin had her password reset through this password recovery option. So, you want to have a secure password recovery, something along the lines, the user goes to the forgot password page, types in their user ID, the app says, hey, if you enter the right user ID, you'll have a link in your email. The user goes, checks his email. There's a HTTPS link which is only valid for a few hours and is a one-time link. Clicks the link. The application then asks the user to answer the security questions that he or she has set up. And once they have answered it correctly, the application allows the user to reset the password. Right? Once the password is reset, the application should send a notification to the user, hey, your password's been reset. The idea is not to have a kind of a weak link in this entire thing. So that's with the password recovery. Now, when you create a new user, you want to make sure that the initial password that the user is assigned is random, right? It shouldn't be fixed for all users, and neither should it be predictable, right? Like if my initial password is my birth date, that's predictable, right? So you want to have it completely random, and mark it as expired so that the user is the one when he first uses it is made to change it. Support disabling and re-enabling of user accounts. Within your application, make sure there's a facility which allows the admin to say, hey, this user is temporarily locked, and once the user has reset the password or whatnot, you can re-enable it. The next one, more in the web application world. These web applications use session IDs to track the user sessions. As far as possible, do not generate them on your own, right? There are underlying frameworks, like for example, IIS, ASP.NET, give you ASP.NET session ID, ASP XORG. On the Java world, you have JSession ID, and these framework issued session IDs are random or sufficiently random so that you don't have an issue of somebody brute forcing or guessing another session ID and accessing another user's data, right? So do not generate session IDs. As far as possible, use the framework issued ones. Email notifications to the user about security sensitive events. So the intent here is, let's say the user's password was to be compromised, right, or was to be reset by an attacker. Having the application email out notifications to the user that, hey, your password change attempt succeeded, right? Or for that matter, if somebody is trying to brute force somebody's account, if the account gets locked out, send an email saying, hey, you had 5 or X amount of failed attempts, your account is logged out. The victim can essentially look at these emails and identify that there's something suspicious going on, and then can report to the application support desk so that there can be necessary steps taken. So have this feedback loop, email notifications from that standpoint. User session inactivity. So the concept here, again, this is more in the web world, but if my session ID is compromised, right? I guess not compromised, but let's say I'm using the application, I walk away from the desk, right? Somebody else walking by, if my session never terminates, right, due to inactivity, they'll be able to abuse my session, right? So having an inactivity timeout kind of stops that abuse, right? If I'm not active on the application for, let's say, 15 minutes, it's going to deactivate the session on the server and make me log in again, right? So that's kind of the concern there. All right, data validation. Now, this. You want to treat all user input as bad input or evil input, so you want to have type, length, range, format checks. However, there are there's like a certain class of vulnerability, the injection attacks. The whole, the main purpose of this injection attack, or the main impact of this injection attack, is to extract data. With SQL injection, sure, you could do much more damaging things. You could compromise the whole SQL server. But the primary intent of doing SQL injection is to extract data, right? And that is exactly what these compliance regulations are trying to safeguard, the data. So, at the very least, you want to use parameterized queries to prevent SQL injection. You want to use parameterized or bind queries to prevent LDAP injection. Similar in the XPath world, where XPath is a querying language for XML datasets. So similar things. Command injection, you don't want to have the user input concatenated to a command that's then run on the server. And then finally, cross-site scripting, again, one of these high-profile vulnerability categories where you want to use output encoding so that your user doesn't have to worry about cross-site scripting attacks. Now, in terms of exception handling, in the web world, again, one of the things that you can do is have a custom error page, right? Which all it says is, hey, we encountered an error. Here's the exception code. Please try again the operation. Or if you still keep on getting this, call the help desk with this exception code, and they can give you the exact details, or I guess extract the details. The idea is, you don't want stack trace or any verbose information going back to the user, because that's in a way information disclosure, which could allow the attacker to plan their next steps and finally get access to this data. Handle all known exceptions. So in some of the compliance regulations, there's a concern about availability, right? Now, there are different ways to do a denial of service attacks. One way is to send specially crafted input to the server so that it generates an exception and crashes, right? So to prevent against that particular kind of attack, you want to handle all known exceptions so that you don't crash at runtime and end up in a denial of service situation. And finally, before you have your catch all handler, you want a specific exception handler, right? So maybe file exception, IO exception, memory exception. So that way, you don't lose any of the exception detail. Auditing and logging. So auditing is highly stressed on in these compliance regulations, and essentially, without an audit log, if an incident happened, right, there's no way to identify, how it happened, what was the damage. There's just no way, right? So from that standpoint, an audit log is absolutely critical and essential, right? So somebody looking at the log, the audit file, should be able to say, hey, who did what to whom and when, right? Essentially, be able to create this timeline based on which you can investigate the incident and take the appropriate action. Now, from an audit logging standpoint, what events or what do you want to log? you want to log all attempts to access objects, right? Maybe failed, maybe successful, right? And similar to login, right? You want to log all successful and failed login attempts. So, what's the idea there is, if you're only logging the successful events, you might have somebody trying to brute force a user account, and unless you log the failed attempt, you won't see that attack in action, right? You will miss that event. So you want to log both successful and failed. And similarly, all administrative actions, like create new user, reset user password, so on and so forth, so that you can have a kind of a complete audit log. And with that audit log, you also want to have certain metadata, right? With every log event, you want certain metadata like the date and time of the event, the source of the action, IP address, the user who was requesting the service, the result, success, failure. It doesn't say here, but you also probably want to add things like the source code file, line numbers, module name, process ID, so that somebody who's looking at a log file, the audit log, can create a timeline. Now, what should not be logged? You don't want to log sensitive data, right? Credit card numbers, any authentication data like passwords, token values. Do not log that, because that's sensitive authentication credential. All right, now configuration management, you want to be able to support configuration of the log file itself. People have different configurations in the environment. If you are using any third-party app components, make sure they are not deployed with the fixed default credentials. Similarly, if you create new users within the application, have dynamic random passwords. And then here's the kind of best practices for crypto and password controls. Now, all this that we talked about so far is more technology oriented, right? But there are things from a developer standpoint that compliance regulation will also touch, which are essentially people and process. So things like train your development team, your testing team, your architects in software security, so that they can design secure software, establish secure coding guidelines, perform prompt security code reviews, testing, and then I guess do not use production data in test, right? That's pretty bad, because production data is real. And then finally, all these third-party libraries that you're using, have somebody in your development team regularly monitor the updates, the vulnerabilities in these third-party components, so that if there are any, you can patch, and then your application won't be vulnerable. All right, so that's kind of all we had. All I had. There's an article in a software magazine that I'm writing, which will be out soon, and then a couple of references on MSDA, which also talk about compliance. So I guess I'll open it up for, I guess we have a few minutes for questions, comments.